Hi everyone. Let me start by putting the slides on so I can concentrate in the talking. I hope you can all see it.
Yes. If you can put them in presentation mode as well.
Presentation mode.
Yep. Now it is.
Okay. Now it is. Okay, great. So yes, thanks very much, Rainer, for the introduction, and good day, everybody. Thanks so much for joining this seminar today and for making time to be in this discussion. So it's really a great pleasure to be here and have an opportunity to share with you some of the work and thoughts that we have in terms of innovation in the informal economy in the context of Africa. So as I was introduced, my name is Erika Kraemer-Mbula, and I'm based at the University of Johannesburg, where I'm heading a research chair in transformative innovation, the fourth industrial revolution, and sustainable development. So our chair is an international collaboration between the University of Johannesburg and also the African Center for Technology Studies, ACTS in Kenya, and the Science Policy Research Unit, SPRU, at the University of Sussex in the UK. So we are mostly, as the introduction mentioned, we are mostly preoccupied with looking at ways in which innovation can be a driver of inclusion and sustainability. So within that whole range of questions and issues, we are particularly interested in the role that public policy plays in steering the direction of innovation efforts, so it can lead us to a more sustainable and inclusive future. So we acknowledge that innovation is not always good for everyone, and if we don't carefully pay attention to some of these dynamics, and particularly the distributional effects of innovation, one can very easily overlook some of the important impact and also some of the actors that are contributing with valuable innovative solutions in society. And we argue this is the case of the informal economy, which is often overlooked, and this is what we will be discussing today. So in my presentation, I'll touch broadly on 3 points. First of all, I will talk about, I'll give a brief overview of the relevance of the informal economy, particularly highlighting its prevalence in the context of Africa. I'll also mention very briefly, some of the challenges that the ongoing pandemic has brought to the informal economy. So I will argue, as I said there, that in the context of Africa, informal is normal. Secondly, I will discuss a little bit of our work, our research looking at innovation in the informal economy. I'll give some very broad findings, and due to time, I'll just focus on some highlights just to give you a flavor of the type of work that we're doing. So I would like to say from the outset that this is not a sort of a presentation of a paper or a research paper, but it's more of a discussion of a topic and give you some ideas on the kind of work that we're doing in this space. And finally, I'll give some reflections, perhaps connecting all of that to policy briefly. So I guess the first question is why should we focus on the informal economy? Well, there are various reasons why, and we will go through some of them over the course of the next half an hour or so. But perhaps the most convincing argument is that this is prevalence. Informality affects labor markets in all countries, including high-income countries, but the way it manifests itself is context-specific. So it would be different how the informal economy manifests in the context of the UK or in the US or in the African context or in any other developing region. It is also important to be reminded of its diversity. We also very often hear references to the informal economy in a sort of homogeneous way. So the informal economy, it's important to remember that it's as diverse as the formal economy. It comprises many activities that range from manufacturing to services, construction, waste collection, and so on. I'll give a little bit of a sense of the sectoral diversity within the informal economy, which is important to bear in mind. And I'll come back to that point of always bearing in mind its diversity. I will not go into definitional issues, although this is a very important discussion, since I will argue later that the concept of informality needs to be further thought through. But this is perhaps another discussion, maybe for another seminar, although I will touch on some of those things here today. It is largely driven by the demand of low-cost, low-income consumers, often based in areas where there is limited access to formal markets, and also there's a very sort of local dimension to the activities of informal actors. They often respond to the immediate needs of the communities surrounding them. So the local dynamics are very relevant when trying to understand the informal economy and innovation within it. This is not to say that they are isolated from global dynamics. So you can see, for instance, the imports of cheap imports affecting opportunities by informal actors and so on. But the day-to-day operation very much relates to local dynamics. And for instance, some of our research shows that most informal actors operate within a range of 20 to 50 kilometers radius around where they're based. Just to give you, to substantiate some of these points, you can see that informality is not homogeneous geographically. So for instance, in the context of South Africa, and you could take any other country, I'm sure, to show similar statistics, the territory matters, so context matters. Even within a single country, you can see the magnitude and the composition of informality being very, very different depending on the province and even at the municipal level, as you can see in this map. Also, speaking to the issue of the locality, townships are often or conventionally seen as these dormant places where there's nothing happening. But if you look from an informal economy lens and informal entrepreneurship lens, you can see townships as vibrant economies, where you can see in this example the constellation of businesses that one can find in an informal settlement, and many of them would be informal businesses. So it is safe to say that in the context of Africa, informal is normal, and this is visible the moment that you step out of a plane and you land in a developing country city, or you step out of where you are and you go into the closest supermarket. You will walk past many informal entrepreneurs and informal businesses along the way. So the figures also confirm this. So you can see that the informal economy contributes to about 3/4 of non-agricultural employment. In the context of Africa, it's about 1/3 of the continent's GDP. It roughly generated about 90% of new jobs in the last decade in Kenya, and that would be in other countries. This is just an illustration. The majority of micro enterprises are informal. About 60% or so in South Africa, and many studies would confirm similar figures. But again, that would apply to many other countries as well. We can see a proliferation of informal settlements, and as I described earlier, informal settlements are locations for informal economic activity. And contrary to the traditional view that we had, where in sort of neoclassical economics, you would see informality as something that would disappear, perhaps with economic growth and modernity. So it would be eventually absorbed into higher productive industrial activities. But the reality actually shows us that the informal economy has increased along with economic growth and modernity, and particularly, although not exclusively, in the context of emerging economies. So in the context, this is more so in the context of the current pandemic, as we see many people have lost their jobs and have moved to informality. So I started indicating that the informality exists in everywhere, but in this graph you can see that it particularly affects Africa, and you can see a higher incidence of informal employment in sub-Saharan Africa as compared to other developing regions. In some of the sub-regions within Africa, it's over 80% of non-agricultural employment. So in this context, you can't consider the informal economy as something that happens in the margins, something that happens underground. It's really the core of our economic and productive fabric, and it deserves attention at the policy level. There's also a lot of creative activity that happens in there, so we need to understand innovation in the informal economy. However, informality has two sides, one can argue, and one can say that it has a sort of a dark side and a bright side, so to speak. So, so there are, on the dark side, there's a clear link between informality and poverty and insecurity, particularly in developing countries. Many individuals and households in marginalized communities that have low levels of education and formal training are often sort of trapped in precarious jobs and low-paid work with very little and no access to social protection. The informal economy also involves often the most vulnerable and marginalized populations, including women, youth, migrants with no papers, and so on. So this one could argue is the negatives, the dark side or negative side of informality. On the brighter side, the informal economy is often identified with having the capacity to generate livelihoods and opportunities for many that wouldn't otherwise. So it's a channel for entrepreneurial energy and provides employment to those that are excluded from the formal sector. And by doing so, it provides a platform for social cohesion, to integrate individuals that may otherwise be excluded, sort of giving that sense of belonging to a community and social integration and so on. Many individuals involved in informal activities also acquire skills through their participation in informality, either through learning by doing or through structured apprenticeships. And several studies have shown the resilience also of the informal economy. We can see it and perhaps reflect on that in the context of the pandemics, but of the current pandemic. But resilience speaks to its ability to sustain shocks and disturbances, often through renewal and adaptation and innovative thinking. And finally, although the informal economy is often linked to pollution and disregard for environmental principles, there's also evidence that some informal activities may contribute to environmental sustainability. And I'll give a very quick example of informal waste collectors, for instance, and how they may contribute to the circular economy. So in the city that I live in Johannesburg, thousands of informal waste pickers make a living out of recycling. They move around 25 tons of recyclable waste from the city landfill annually, and they save about R1 billion per annum in landfill space. They pull all of this by foot, up to 20 kilometers a day, and they are tightly connected to a formal chain of recycling, and I will get back to this later, the connections between the formal and informal value or production chains, which is something that cannot be disregarded. Largely due to their work, South Africa recycles much more of its plastic than we find in other mature economies. And when you look in detail, you can connect the activities of informal waste collectors to many positive contributions to specific SDGs. This is an example. Coming back to the diversity and heterogeneity of informal economic activity, there are several studies that moving away from this homogeneous view of the informal economy, often seen as a survivalist activity with little signs of dynamism and so on, several studies have portrayed and given us some insights on the different categories of informal enterprises that one can find. And they have identified often, in academics, as we like for some reason to get into these three categories, but they have, this is an example, but we have identified various categories of informal entrepreneurs. These are some examples. So often you can find the survivalist of the lower tier, engaged in formal economic activity because they lack opportunities elsewhere. But you also find other types of entrepreneurs from moving up from the survivalist, others that join the informal economy for other reasons and with other motivations, often to be their own boss, to try and test new ideas before they are ready to launch them to the formal market. And in that case, they use it as a test bed for innovation. So there are different motivations that relate to different types of entrepreneurs or enterprises that we may find within the informal economy. Very quickly, I would like to reflect on perhaps reflecting on that vulnerable or the dark side of informality and the impact that COVID-19 has had on informal economic activity. So these are the results of a study that is being conducted by an organization called WeGo that does a lot of work on the informal economy, and they ran a survey looking at the impact of the lockdown in South Africa, in particular in one of the cities in Durban. So in South Africa, there was a strict lockdown, as in many other countries, where taxi ranks, train stations, urban centers were all closed. So during this time, informal traders, for instance, were not allowed to operate, and they lost their livelihoods. Many of them lost the stock and of course, the lack of income. Women were the worst hit because they are not only the majority of street traders, but also they acquired higher responsibilities in terms of care and childcare often and household. And many of them, also women, engage in informal activities that require personal contact, like hair salons, domestic workers, childminders, traditional healers, and so on. So women often, and in particular in South Africa, they suffer the worst social impact from the lockdown. Essentially, for many of these workers, losing their day-to-day activities and without savings meant that they put them straight into poverty. And you can see that in the province of Gauteng, the number of people going hungry at least doubled in the first 2 weeks of lockdown, and many of them were informal actors. So they engaged into different coping strategies. Many of them borrowed money or had to use their savings or look for financial support from friends and family, which put them often at in a harder position to get out of a very difficult situation. So this speaks to the hardship that the informal economy and the insecurity that comes together with being engaged in informality. And the national statistics in South Africa also indicates that the informal sector during 2020 has increased, which again confirms the view that the informal economy can act as a shock absorber in a way for the formal economy in times of crisis. On the other side of the coin, we have a lot of innovation activity emerging out of the informal sector, which is testament of its resilience and ability to respond to these new realities. So the informal sector responded creatively and rapidly to the COVID-19 pandemic. And some examples include some of the track and trace services in informal settlements that were organized locally and domestic and informally. Many group and community structures providing services in terms of collecting data on residents and facilities emerged. The informal economy also responded quite rapidly to the production of face masks, which are compulsory in South Africa, as well as hand sanitizer. We've seen the development of an installation of innovative hand washing stations, as you can see in the picture on the right, often mobile and handmade with limited technologies. And there are many examples, and we still don't have sufficient efforts to collect this type of innovations more systematically. And perhaps it's a matter of thinking, what are the lessons and that we can get out of these innovations emerging informally, and what can we think of in terms of upscaling innovative solutions that have emerged informally during this time of the pandemic. But that is perhaps a different discussion to take forward. So some of our research on innovation in the informal economy that we engage in our unit is featured in this slide. Besides the publications, these are some examples there. We have a number of PhDs and postdocs in our unit engaged in ongoing research, and we have several papers under development. We also run projects and data collection covering many aspects of informality in relation to innovation. And we coordinate a thematic area in informal sector innovation under the Open African Innovation Research Network, OpenAIR. We also have a policy experimentation platform where we engage with government agencies in discussions around informality. So I won't be able to discuss, even I will not even attempt to summarize all of these studies here. I'll just, as I mentioned at the beginning, I just want to give you in the next 10-15 minutes some ideas about the methods that we use, the kind of data that we collect, some of the findings from various studies that we have done and others that are ongoing. So it's just to give you a flavor of what we're doing rather than to present a particular study. We locate our work in the tradition of evolutionary economics, particularly a neo-Schumpeterian view of innovation. This tradition aims to understand the dynamic processes that cause qualitative transformation of economies, basically driven by innovation. So we usually see this tradition associated with radical innovations, and many of you will be familiar with the work by Freeman and others. But we follow particularly the work from scholars that acknowledge that innovation come in different shapes, not only technological but also organizational, and in different sizes, ranging from more radical innovation to more minor and incremental types of innovations. Not only sort of, the techno-economic paradigm, large changes into the system. So all of them matter, and particularly in the developing country perspective. Innovation is not something that happens only in high-tech environments or the manufacturing industry. Innovation from an evolutionary perspective has to be understood as context-specific, and particularly we give particular importance to the context in shaping the selection process of innovation, following the work of many authors such as Nelson Winter and others. In other words, innovation sort of reflects the economic and social conditions in which these innovations are conceived, shaped, and made available to users. So we'll carry that thought into the systemic lens of innovation as well. So we rely on the literature on innovation systems, which is pioneered by scholars such as Freeman, Lundvall, and Nelson, and others. They highlight the importance of interactive learning, of linkages, of institutions, in understanding the processes that generate, that use and adopt and drive the adoption of innovations. I must mention that this literature has been generated, the literature on innovation system was generated largely in the context of advanced or mature economies, and often disregard essential aspects that are relevant in a developing country context, such as the informal economy. So within this literature, there have been also efforts and useful frameworks that have emerged as a result of scholarly efforts to try and adapt the innovation systems framework in a developing country context. And one of them is the local innovation and production systems approach, or LIPS. This literature that has emerged in the context of Brazil give us very, very valuable insights to look at the local specificities of innovation dynamics. And it looks at the entire arrangement or the value chain from production of raw materials to commercialization to really understand production and innovation activities in developing countries. Not only looking at productive actors, but also political and social actors around them and the environment in which they are located. And then thirdly, we have the large literature on firm level studies on learning and accumulation of different types of capabilities in developing countries, not only technological capabilities, but also organizational, production capabilities, innovation capabilities. And there's a large literature there that I will not try to summarize, but it provides some very useful taxonomies and classifications of innovation activities by firms, from more basic to more dynamic. So this is basically our underlying literature where we position ourselves. Just to give you a couple of illustrations, in our work we have also highlighted the importance of looking at the informal economy, not on its own, but as part and parcel of the economic reality of developing countries. So formality and informality are actually not a binary, is not part of this binary concept, but a continuum where we see actors with different degrees of formality or informality exchanging goods and services and knowledge. So this is an example of a value chain and the linkages that exist between the formal and informal in a study of cosmetics in South Africa, for instance. And even more, as I mentioned earlier, we see informality as part of a system. We take a systemic perspective, looking at the local innovation system surrounding innovation activities, which includes municipal governments, training and education organizations, representation organizations, NGOs, and so on. So some examples of evidence that we work with in our work. I'll give some examples of data sources that may give some ideas of the type of analysis that one can do in this area. So we had one project, for instance, in several years ago, looking at innovation and knowledge appropriation in the informal economy. It was supported by WIPO. We looked at 3 subsectors: manufacturing of traditional medicines, better workers, and home and personal care products in 3 African countries. We targeted with this study informal entrepreneurs, and we also looked at surrounding actors in the system, those meso and macro level actors, trying to gather qualitative information about the types of linkages that were working and not working in connecting with the needs of informal entrepreneurs. We developed a survey tool and we started thinking about ideas towards measurement. Then there was a follow-up study that we did looking at work organization, competence building, and innovation in formal and informal micro enterprises. In this case, we looked at 7 subsectors in 4 African countries, and we did an interview to about 300 informal employers and their employees, and also actors at the meso at the macro level. We expanded the survey tool, and we, in this case, looked at not only employers but employees, trying to find the both dimensions of both perspectives of innovation activity within firms. And then I'll also present some preliminary analysis of data that was collected for micro and small enterprises in the city of Johannesburg. This was conducted under a project called Community of Practice in Innovation and Inclusive Industrialization, which was hosted by the South African Research Chair in Industrial Development at the University of Johannesburg. So this was focused on manufacturing activities and gathered data on 711 respondents located in the city of Johannesburg. And it included both registered and non-registered business. So it looked at different aspects of business performance, learning processes, and innovation activities. And it looked also at the adoption of digital technologies by firms, and I will present a little bit of that data here. So overall, our research, and when I say our research, these are views from several of the projects that we've run and some of the analysis that we've done utilizing other sources of data that have not been gathered by ourselves. Our research shows, and we have been able to distill some of the features of innovation in the informal economy. So what we see is that the informal economy doesn't conform to the stereotypical sort of R&D patent-driven high-tech modality of innovation that is captured in the conventional statistics. We see that some R&D actually does take place, especially when we adopt a broad definition of R&D, depending on sectors and size, but but most of the informal enterprises actually do not engage in R&D, and they working in a condition of scarcity. They often rely on collaboration rather. So the open exchange of ideas and collaboration is quite prevalent in the context of informality. We see informal entrepreneurs adopting and adapting equipment and technologies to improve their production processes and innovate. We see them often adapting imported technologies to their local conditions, and I will briefly comment on this regarding digital technologies. We also see innovations diffusing very fast, often through copying and imitation, which has some implications for intellectual property policy, often driven by social dynamics, especially in actors that gather around clusters or tightly connected communities, where copying and imitation dynamics are much more predominant than in more dispersed areas. Another interesting feature is that many innovations in the informal economy adhere to the principles of the circular economy, as I mentioned earlier, minimizing resources, recycling, reusing, repurposing, which I think provides very interesting lessons in the context of the SDGs, where we strive to find sustainable solutions. In general, informal actors innovate under conditions of scarcity, which already provides a very useful ground to think about innovation for sustainable development rather than innovation in conditions of abundance or endless growth. So some of the key findings that I will present in the next 5 minutes or so relate to some of this evidence, showing some of this evidence. Through our research, we found evidence of innovative behavior by informal entrepreneurs. In our studies, more or less, depending on the sector, we've seen about 60 or so % of the respondents in some of those projects that I mentioned earlier, reporting some type of innovation. We see that innovation is often rarely new to the world or new to the market, but is often new to the firm, and is usually an adaptation or modification of an existing solution. And this is what I try to find to illustrate here with this table from one of our papers, based on the study of 7 sectors in 4 African countries, where you can see that in terms of product innovation and process innovation, most of the firms report it being a modification or an adaptation of an existing solution. This is the average for all sectors, but then you see also the sectoral differences that we find between agro-processing, clothing and textiles, ICTs, waste and recycling, repair and maintenance, and so on. So there are sectoral differences, and they are usually modifications or adaptations. And that also applies to organizational innovation and to marketing innovation. Another key finding is that informality is not only about business registration; it's broader than that, and that is an area for further research, because we see that micro enterprises do tend to be survivalist, and there's something about size. Size matters when it comes to informality. Smaller firms seem to share similar challenges, and larger firms with more resources seem to be able to engage in more sophisticated innovation activities, such as the adoption of digital technologies. And I will show some evidence in that respect. You see, for instance, here in terms of the prevalence of informality among micro and small enterprises, you see that nearly 82% of the respondents in the survey that was conducted in the city of Johannesburg, involving about nearly 700 firms, but we were able to use data for 677. About 82% of the micro enterprises were non-registered, versus the 60% on larger firms with 6 to 25 employees. So there's an element of informality that is linked to the size of the firm, and we need to untangle that and unpack that a little bit more in more detail through econometrics, which I won't be able to present today. We see also, again, the differences in terms of innovation related to size. We see micro enterprises with less than 5 employees displaying lower levels of innovation as compared to small enterprises between 6 and 25 employees, with 46% incidence of innovation in products, services, or processes. And then we see, when we look at digital technologies, there seems to be some differences regarding registration, which leads to some interesting discussions and research looking forward. So, for instance, if you focus on that green square at the end, when you look at registered and not registered firms, you see the differences in terms of percentages. These are just some descriptives on social media presence. So, for instance, you see registered firms have a larger social media presence regarding to non-registered firms. We see some significant differences in terms of utilizing the internet, using through the mobile phone, engaging with customers through the mobile phone. Online sales, again, they are much larger in those registered firms, as well as the use of mobile banking and the probability of having a website. So we can see that that registration does play a role or has an impact when it comes to the use of digital technologies, which is quite an important discussion when we're speaking about digital transformation, particularly in the African continent. It's a big discussion. So this is and very shortly, I will not focus very much on this. The results of a probit regression looking at the impact of new digital technologies on innovation, where you see that that the use of social media, surfing in the internet, and also R&D activities have an impact on innovation, a significant impact on innovation. So we can see that the adoption of these technologies can have an impact on innovation performance, and that the low rates of use of these technologies for micro enterprises already hints at some policy interventions or areas that can be supported if we are looking at ways in which we can improve the innovation performance of informal enterprises. Finally, I want to talk about the importance of the linkages with the broader innovation system, and something that we found particularly when we inquire about the obstacles that informal enterprises face to innovate. Many of them reported having low skills level, particularly when it comes to computer skills, to business planning, and to financial skills. So there's clearly a deficiency in terms of skills that also relates to innovation. When you look at quantitative analysis of these variables against innovation, you will see that having these skills has a positive impact on innovation, but companies are reporting it as areas where they are struggling to acquire them in order to innovate. And another obstacle to innovation that is reported is the difficulties that these firms face when it comes to having business support from outside organizations. They report that they don't find it easy to organize training with external providers or support institutions, or they struggle to get loans or financial support from external support institutions. So these high levels, or the high number of employers or informal entrepreneurs that reported these difficulties in engaging with the broader system gives us a sense of how important it is to adopt this broad view of innovation in the informal economy, and finding ways of assisting entrepreneurs to connect with training organizations, with financial organizations, with business support providers, and so on. So let me conclude with some reflections in the next minute. So what do we need to think about, particularly policymakers? An important starting point is to recognize the importance of the informal economy at the policy level. We often find innovation policies completely being silent about informality. Even in discussions around how to support micro enterprises, when we see that there's such a high incidence of informality in micro enterprises, informal actors are not regarded as beneficiaries of many of the policy interventions. Another important point is to address the basic needs of informal actors that are in vulnerable conditions. So as we discussed at the beginning, there's a strong connection between informality and poverty and insecurity. And given the heavy economic impact, particularly that the pandemic has had and continues to have in informal actors, economic relief benefits must be delivered effectively and with accessible application processes. Childcare facilities can be provided for those women that struggle to combine informal work with the household responsibilities. The extension of social protection aimed at informal workers needs to be improved and so on. Then it is essential that policymakers acknowledge that informal economic activity needs to be supported and facilitated rather than chased away or having the good confiscated, which is very often the scenario in urban areas in developing countries and in African countries as well. It's very important to think about supporting local innovation systems. As I mentioned earlier, many of the informal actors suffer from the disconnection or the isolation with the broader set of actors, particularly important at the local level, and building those non-traditional partnerships between, for instance, training organizations or business support services with informal sector associations, for instance. And those kind of interventions need to be very mindful of the different attributes of these communities and stakeholders participating in local innovation systems. It is very important to think about the types of data that we need to be able to have a more informed picture of the types of innovations that occur in the informal economy, and thinking about measurement is essential in that respect. Our current innovation surveys do not gather data on informality, and we need to think about what does innovation mean in an informal context, and how can we develop suitable indicators and data collection tools, such as surveys, that help us gather that and make more appropriate decisions in that space. Addressing the digital divide is essential, and I showed very briefly our findings in this aspect, but the pandemic has really brought everything to the digital space. We are all operating online, the seminar is happening online, and we see a digitization of economic and social activity happening in all realms. So same is happening in the informal economy, and we can, but we still see that many of the informal enterprises struggle to access some of these digital platforms and technologies. And finally, thinking creatively about how to support the informal economy and innovation in that space requires policy experimentation. It needs to try and test and adapt new policy instruments. Very few African countries are thinking proactively in terms of supporting innovation in the informal economy. And given its local specificities, it may require to think about developing local interventions that may be replicated or upscaled to larger territories, but policy experimentation is essential in this space. Let me finish here. I hope I haven't taken too much time. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much for this fascinating presentation. And we already have some questions from the audience, but first, Kate, you have immediate reactions and comments.
Great. First of all, thank you so much, Erika. Just wonderful presentation, really interesting work, and a great way to sort of think about innovation in a way that's not so often taught in our classrooms. I think one of my first sort of things to appreciate about your work, both in your presentation and your writing, is that you talk about how our theory of innovation, our understanding of innovation systems has been sort of built around the experience of industrial economies in the global north. And so by looking at innovation in other areas, we start to sort of appreciate or challenge what does innovation mean, who is innovative. And then I think those insights actually translate very well back to thinking about the global north, thinking about industrialized economies. This really struck me with your final recommendations, because I think all of those apply just as well when thinking about people in the informal economy, women's work, those of us who were hustling during the COVID pandemic, and how thinking about how do governments, how do states support those in this kind of informal work, doing women's work in particular, how that comes up. So I think your work is wonderful for sort of pulling back, but then providing insights that are really quite universal. I think my main question, or my main sort of provocation back to you is really about the term informality. And you sort of previewed that maybe this was a bigger discussion, but it isn't, the title of your book. So I'm sure you've thought a huge amount about whether or not the term informality is meaningful. I think it's an interesting question. I've done work in my own research looks at when big companies from the global north work in places like Kenya, where my research is. And a lot of the questions in that literature ask questions about precarious work, and saying, the forms of work that come when companies work with people in Kibera, for example, is precarious work. And then scholars respond and say, well, precarity only makes sense when you're talking about sort of a Fordist economy, where the idea of stable work is the norm, or maybe that's not even the norm these days. So if we does informality, does it really still contrast? What is the contrast to formality? Are we concerned with things like adverse incorporation? If we're, when you compared registered firms, those who were formalized and those who are not formalized, is that actually sort of a proxy for something else that's going on between those firms? So I'm sort of curious about some of your thinking on informality, precarity, and also, I think maybe the final thing, and this comes up actually in one of the questions, is when we see employment, so formalization of work, that recreates some of the conditions of informality or precarity. So even though someone's employed in something like gig work, they're not actually getting protections, they're not actually getting what we associate with the benefits of formalized labor. So, maybe to speak a little bit more about that spectrum and what that category of informality means to you, particularly in comparison with formalization. That's a very long-winded question. I think my third question, I'm again, my own research and my own teaching is really interested in North-South relations. And there's been a lot of interest in ideas of frugal innovation, or what's sometimes called reverse innovation, where companies from the global north go to the global south, and they look at innovation that's happening and then bring it back and incorporate it in their cars and their cell phone designs, all of that. Dual SIM is a great example. And I'd be interested in your response to that. Is this something that you find interesting, positive, or is this something you see as extractive and problematic? There's a lot of sort of debate about these concepts of frugal innovation or reverse innovation. And then my final question, the easiest one, you talked about doing surveys, doing interview work, and I always ask people who are collecting their own data, what surprised you? What stuck out? What did you go in expecting to hear, and then sort of caught you by surprise? So yeah, so those are my sort of 4 reflections, and my primary questions being about, informality, and is that a meaningful category, pro-poor or frugal, reverse innovation, some of those terms, and whether or not they're problematic or useful, and then the sort of question of being surprised. But really wonderful presentation, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kate. So Erika.
Thanks so much, Kate, for these reflections. Like each one of these requires a lot of discussion. So they're not easy questions, which are usually the best questions. So thanks so much for posing those to me. Regarding the concept of informality and whether it's meaningful or not. It is a very important question, and as I did mention that it requires a lot of more thinking. And even though I utilize the language myself, I find myself sort of explaining why I don't, even I talk about formal and informal. So I utilize the binary representation of the term. But in my work, I often spend quite a lot of time explaining why a binary approach is not appropriate. I think we lack of a better term, perhaps, and that's why we're still utilizing that term despite the embedded sort of weaknesses in it. I think one has to look at or utilize, or at least the way I use it, is reflect on issues around informality. Is there something about informality that is inherent to being informal, and what is it to be informal? Is it only about business registration? What we're finding out is that it's not only about registration. It's not about paying taxes or not. There are some characteristics that have to do with the size, and there are some characteristics that have to do with the community and the place in which these enterprises are based, which is very much connected to cultural and social dynamics in a way that other businesses are not. So what makes an informal business different to small business elsewhere? And this is what we're trying to unpack, right? Is there something inherently special about being informal? And what are those features? And what are the degrees of informality? What sort of, because you find in many cases, businesses that are registered, that are operating very informally. They don't have contracts with the employees, they don't have accounts, they don't have, but they still have a business registration. So what does having a business registration mean? Is that the whole spectrum of informality? And I think it's a good entry point. Thinking about informality, to me, is an entry point to explore all of these issues, for which we don't have the right terminology, perhaps. but I use that terminology to enter that space where I can look at these things. I hope that makes sense. But again, looking at the connection between the formal and informal starts giving us a more sort of detailed and granular view of that gray area that is between formal and informal and everything in between. What is that everything in between? So that's to me how I utilize the language and how I utilize it as a window to explore all of these other issues that have to do with social dynamics, with community dynamics, with inclusion, with exclusion, and so on. The second question. Sorry, the second question. I think I'm jumping one question, but remind me if I don't address one of them, what it was. I'm going to the frugal innovation and the debates around there and what I think about that, whether it's extractive or not. It's interesting because the literature has evolved in various different ways, and you will find some of the literature, depending on there are different, different flavors, so different things that are highlighted in the various definitions. So even though one may talk about grassroots, frugal, bottom of the pyramid, Jude, and all of that in the same category, actually, when you look at and social innovation, when you look at the definitions carefully, you will see different aspects that are highlighted. And I think it's important as academics to look at those at that level of detail. There's some of these definitions and literature that would highlight innovations that are sort of for the poor, in a way, looking at the poor as a market. So as consumers, that require products and services, and it would be about looking at the processes and innovation activities that often large multinationals or smaller firms engage in to produce cheap products that can be accessible by low-income consumers. That is a very different approach to some of the grassroots innovation literature, for instance, that may look at innovations emerging from poor communities, which is a different level of agency, right? So it's about innovation for the poor, innovation by the poor, innovation from the poor for the poor, and it depends on how the level of agency that poor communities have in generating those innovations, and them resulting in higher levels of learning and capabilities that may improve well-being in different ways than it would be to buy a cheap mobile phone, which in some cases can have a very positive impact in innovation activity as well, as we have seen in our research, that utilizing social media and adopting some of these digital technologies can have a positive impact on innovation, but the processes are very different. So I think when we think about inclusive development and long-term sustainability, we may want to look at these processes by which vulnerable and marginalized communities acquire learning and knowledge and innovate themselves in a way that leads to broader sort of economic and social outcomes. Then another question that you posed, and I know that I'm forgetting one, so please remind me, is what did you learn out of data collection when you engage with this type of issues, with policymakers and informal entrepreneurs and so on? I have to say that engaging in fieldwork is one of the most gratifying, from my point of view as a researcher, parts of my research. Is the part that I love the most. Then the second favorite part is when you have all your analysis and you get all of these interesting results, right? But talking to people and learning about the interpretation of these sort of scholarly definitions that we generate in our desks and our laptops, how do they translate into the reality of vulnerable communities is very enriching for a researcher to actually have that grounded knowledge of reality. I think it helps me as a scholar to be able to put all of these concepts and data into the frame of reality. I think it is very important. Something that surprises me is the language that we use. So concepts that we take for granted, such as networking and learning and knowledge and innovation, all of these things that we assume that are sort of self-explanatory, for many of the interviewees, it is not as obvious. So when you go and gather data, make sure that you test your tool. Make sure that you're able to explain, have 3 or 4 explanations of what you want to, because that if you want to be culturally sensitive as well, knowledge may have a different connotation in a different culture than yours, and what constitutes knowledge can be a very differently interpreted depending on who the receiver of that information is. Something when you talk to policymakers and you talk to entrepreneurs on the ground, is quite interesting to know or to realize how often, I'm not saying always, often how little policymakers engage with actual sort of actors on the ground. And I think there's this idea, especially when in the context of the developing countries, a lot of policy interventions in this space are top-down approaches. So it comes from many assumptions about the needs, the challenges, the circumstances of informal entrepreneurs, and it's quite surprising to see how little grounded they are on data and evidence. That's why I highlight in my presentation at the end the importance of having systematic data collections in this space, so we can inform, we can engage with policymakers on a more regular basis. In many cases, the data is outdated, is not representative, and often yes, it fails to capture the heterogeneity and the locality and the context specificity of these dynamics. So yes, maybe let me stop there and open it up for other questions.
Thanks. Kate, do you have any follow-ups, or you're happy with the?
I think that's great. We've got some wonderful questions in the Q&A box, so I'm happy to go to those.
Yeah, exactly. And then see if we have quite a lot of questions. So I think we don't, bring people to the panel, but rather just take the questions. And yeah, maybe you can start from the top. The first question from Florian Zabel: what role can play platforms and the gig economy in making the transition from informal to formal labor? I think you started to discuss that around digital divide. So yeah, but go ahead.
Yes, I think there are some similarities in the gig economy and the informal economy that may perhaps at a conceptual level lead us to think that there could be a good avenue for transition to formalization. I would also like to maybe highlight that in our research we're looking mostly at informal enterprises rather than informal labor, which is a slightly different discussion is connected to informal the informal economy and entrepreneurship, but there are some differences. Something that we've and when we talk about transition to formalization, there is how to put it. There is, from my point of view, and often an obsession, perhaps, with formalizing the informal as a way of supporting the sector and saying, okay, if you formalize, if you register, if you pay taxes, then we can start having a conversation about how to grow the company and how to improve the social the work conditions and so on. However, I think the starting point, what our research is telling us, is that once you support informal actors in the activities they are doing, and you help them grow and upgrade in whatever the sector of activity is, once they reach a certain level, there's a natural incentive to formalize. So what we see is firms that operate below, and you've seen in one of the graphs that I presented, those that are micro enterprises. Often, if you look at sales as well, those that are below a particular threshold, they tend to operate informally because they don't have an incentive to formalize. If you do the cost-benefit analysis from their point of view, it makes more sense to remain informal below a certain threshold. And if you help companies to break through that threshold, they will naturally sort of have an incentive to informalize. They'll see more opportunities in getting a loan from the bank, of accessing some support from government, on engaging in this training opportunity that this institute is providing, and so on. So they will start seeing the benefits of formalization after they have passed that threshold. So when I think about transition to formalization, I think about, let us find out better what the challenges, what the needs, what the circumstances of informal actors are. Let's help them grow, and formalization will come. So obviously, it's not as simple as that, and there are many support and many entry points for policymakers to ensure that there's a constant engagement with that process. But put simplistically, that's how I see it. Kate, I think you mentioned you wanted to come in.
Yeah, this is such a great question, and actually really relates to some work that I've been doing with a large multinational that's been doing route to market or just micro distribution work. So spreading their products, doing last mile distribution through working with what they're calling micro entrepreneurs. And I think what the analysis that I've been doing with a colleague at SOAS really says, if you look at the employment relationship, really this is gig work. This is really, informal, there's not a set contract, they get paid per item sold, and they're really boxed out of some of the protections that we associate with formalized labor. So no sick leave, no insurance, all of these things that we really say, oh, a big multinational fancy US company coming to work here, this is going to have benefits for the labor force. Well, actually, through using this micro-entrepreneurship discourse and this sort of gig work model, we're seeing that they're benefiting from the networks that these folks have, making a lot of money, and then keeping them at arm's length, not extending some of these benefits that we associate with strong institutions, strong companies into the labor force. So I think gig work in this kind of dependent contractor status is really, difficult. It creates this category, this sort of gray area category where people can be formalized but kept precarious. And I think it's a real concern.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely. And I think probably that has something to do with the entire sort of digital economy, especially being driven by this, network effects and user growth, then is all important, or seen as all important, whether it actually is or not. And I think that the next question from Benjamin really is sort of another spin on the same question, I guess, that he asked. Then is it more important that innovation policy focus on making formalization easier, as we were just discussing, and more flexible so businesses can formalize to access government innovation support, or that innovation policy support for innovation becomes more accessible to formal organizations? So what do you think, Erika?
Yes. So my short answer is the second. So I in line with my argument earlier, is about extending support to informal businesses in an understanding that they are also innovation actors in the system. They are coming up with innovative solutions, innovative products, services, processes, often targeting sort of overlooked demands in low-income communities. They are adding a lot of value to local economic development. So recognize them as innovation actors, as innovation enterprises, innovative enterprises, and thinking of ways in which government support to innovation can be extended to informal actors in such a way that, and acknowledging that supporting innovation activities has a positive effect on their performance, including sales and employment and so on. As I mentioned earlier, they will reach a point where they will break that threshold and they will naturally formalize. So that would be my advice. Actually, there's in this book that I mentioned earlier, Innovation in the Informal Economy, one of the chapters that we wrote has to do with policy approaches to the to innovation in the informal economy, and that is precisely the angle that we are arguing should be the way forward. And we give specific, sort of more detailed thought about different types of government interventions in innovation policy or innovation policy areas, and how can they be extended to informal enterprises. Thanks for that question.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting answer, and an interesting topic in general. So almost like a reverse innovation policy. The policy follows where the informal economy is, which of course, begs all kinds of questions, because a lot of innovation policy is based on like market failure. But if you don't have a formalized market, so what are you looking for? What kind of markets you're looking for? So it's sort of asked for innovation policymakers to really have a very different, epistemological mindset of what are we actually looking for, or how do we understand? So I think that's a really great way of looking at it. So now we have an anonymous attendee. How can the government support and facilitation help the informal sector for graduate enter formal sector? I think you have pretty much answered that, which is sort of make their growth actually possible, which in itself is a almost like counterintuitive answer, because I think the knee-jerk reaction is how can we get rid of informal economy through regulation, and your answer is how can we let them grow, because then they actually want to formalize anyway, which I think is a really a great point in itself, or whether we talk about innovation or not. So we get to Ashley Harris. I would be grateful to know if there is any existing research on informal cultural industries and innovation. Knowledge would be one example, but these are normally discussed only in cultural studies. If you know of any research from an economic and development perspective, I'd be very grateful to know about it. Yeah, great question.
Yes, thanks for this question. It's I have a colleague actually that is. I mentioned earlier that we are coordinating the informal sector innovation thematic area within the Open African Innovation Research Network, Open Air, and one of our colleagues working in that network is doing a lot of very interesting work, particularly in this space. He's looking at he's a Nigerian colleague working in Canada, and he has done a lot of work on Nollywood and creative industries and informality within that intersection. So I'll be very happy to give you some references to his work. His name is Chidi Owamanan.
Awesome, thank you. And then we have one more question from Olga Mihaeva. And so thank you very much, Erika. My question is about distributional elements of innovation policies, which are not addressed even by conventional innovation policies, publicly funded R&D as such. Whether and to what extent understanding and studying informal innovation can help us bringing in the distributional elements questions into innovation policies. Yeah, great question.
So this question is about the distributional effects.
Yeah, the question is, as we are studying the informal elements or informal innovation systems, as it were, do we then understand better the distributional effects of innovation or elements of innovation in general?
Yes.
Or can we understand?
Yes, this is a great question as well, because I think there's some what we do in utilizing an innovation studies angle is we are especially looking at innovations, as I mentioned earlier, that level of agency, right? So it's innovations that are emerging from informal entrepreneurs, acknowledging that a large proportion of those may be subject to sort of vulnerable conditions. So understanding that they're sort of in the losing end of the distributional effects, right? So innovation studies helps us understand the distributional effects of innovation or the distributional aspects of innovation from that lens, in terms of understanding to what extent are those actors acquiring knowledge and learning and accumulating capabilities that help them come up with new ideas that provide solutions and that improve most likely the communities around them. In other words, they are improving the well-being of the immediate communities through the innovation activities, right? So there's one angle of the distributional aspects that we can cover there, but there are other angles, other distributional aspects that we cannot cover through our innovation studies lens, and that would require looking perhaps at the broader. I mean, you will have to look and have a more sophisticated analysis of the local system. For instance, you will have to look at in more detail about what are they. Because the thing is, the moment that there are winners, there's always losers. So even when you talk about adoption of new technologies, and you say, okay, let's devise an intervention that will assist informal entrepreneurs with access to mobile devices and free data and whatever. Okay, let's think about that kind of policy intervention. So if you look at this, if you want to really look at the distributional effects, you would look at the impact of that intervention on the informal entrepreneurs that have benefited from that. But there would be others that haven't, and there would be others that are not. The moment that there's an intervention there, you have to look at the two sides of the coin. Who wins and who loses, and how can you mitigate, and how can you keep on supporting those that remain on the non-receiving end. So that having a real sense of the distributional aspects related to innovation is actually quite complex and requires is a moving target. In other words. You have to be constantly refreshing who are the marginalized communities in every scenario. So it requires more sophisticated tools or perhaps complementary tools to the ones that we have through our studies of innovation and informal enterprises. We can only look at one dimension of it or several dimensions of it, but there are others that remain outside of our scope with the tools that we utilize by looking at informal enterprises. Yeah.
I mean, you referred to initially that you come from sort of evolutionary innovation economic school, and I think this there's always like an implicit assumption that I don't think really has been followed through. That the more let's say that the intensity of innovation systems leads to sort of co-evolution of social innovations in terms of like some sort of welfare systems and whatnot. I think it hasn't been really proven or studied in that sense, but I think it would be like an interesting exercise if you look at informal township economies where you have a lot of innovation going on, whether there is a accompanying social innovations, maybe informal social innovations that are sort of proto institutions of social economies. Taking care of the community, providing some sort of funding for community activities, which is also like culturally, if you go back to even the ancient Greece before taxation systems, you had this idea that once your wealth is growing, you're supposed to give back to community by sort of organizing some festivals or whatever. So there is probably an interesting hypothesis there as well. Yeah, so there is let me see how there is an appreciation from Ashley. Great. Yeah, so I think it's been a really illuminating presentation, and I think there's a lot of questions, and it's really an opening up of a new research field. And maybe we can, I don't know, Kate, if you have any more questions and comments, or Kate?
No, just an appreciation for this work, and
great.
Particularly teaching in a place like UCL or the other places where we teach, where our student body is coming from all over the world. I think we can't get stuck just studying and thinking about a very small percentage of countries that have these highly industrialized economies. So this is like, just like you were saying, informal is normal. Informal is normal or common really globally, and so this needs to be much more centered in our understanding of innovation in our discussions. So thank you.
Yeah, and before we go, I mean, the last thing I wanted to ask you, Erika, is to shed some light on your sort of immediate future research. What can we hope to read from you in this space or in another areas? So it's very fascinating what you're doing.
Yes, thanks for the reflections, and thanks, Rainer, for that, for those thoughts in terms of expanding the tools, or even the analytical tools to think about the distributional effects. I think there's a research agenda that really needs to unfold from a recognition of informality being the economy, or at least the economy that is prevalent in most developing countries, certainly in the African context. And from my point of view, when we think about informality, as we discussed at the beginning, it's about understanding these underlying social economic agency type of dynamics that really will help us get, rather than that sort of a commitment to the terminology. Is about understanding those dynamics. That is to me the ultimate goal. How can we actually use this as a tool to get to unpack those dynamics that continue to be completely overlooked in the way we think about economic and social policy. In the African context, we tend to emulate policy approaches that have, particularly in the sphere of innovation, that have been developed as well. So sometimes we think in terms of, we need to focus too much on supporting formal R&D, on supporting global value chains and so on, even though it's a very important part of our economic reality and our prospects moving forward. We cannot ignore such a large portion of economic activity that happens perhaps following other dynamics and motivations, and has a different type of social connection to the other economic activities. So I think when we think about supporting informality, the message that I want to give is that it is not about enlarging those, and when we look at the positive and the negative sides, you know, it's not like informality is this rosy place where only entrepreneurship and happy employment happens. That is not an accurate representation of reality. There's a dark side to informality, about precariousness that you mentioned, Kate, and about a lack of security, about really lives of vulnerable communities put under stake. So it's about protecting and supporting those vulnerabilities that are embedded in informal activity, but also supporting the positives and ensuring that entrepreneurship, that innovation that is taking place in that context is upgraded, and is taken to a level when it can become part and parcel of the broader innovation system much more effectively. So it's about nurturing innovation systems and ensuring that all actors that contribute to innovation and creativity and solutions are adequately supported, taking into account the specific needs, the challenges that they face, and ensuring that it's about supporting the networks and the linkages that form our innovation systems to lead us to more inclusive and sustainable outcomes. So that is how I see the picture of informal economy in the African context.
Yeah, really interesting and very promising research field. So there is one more question. We have like a few more minutes, so we can quickly.
Oh, sorry, Rainer. I sorry. Before you go to the other question, I forgot to mention. You asked a specific question about future areas for research that I didn't answer.
Yeah.
And I think I hinted at it in the presentation, but the digital economies. I mean, the whole discussion around digital transformation in the continent. And as you know, the chair that I'm leading has to do, has this angle on frontier technologies and digitization and 4IR and so on. So to me, it's very interesting to see how that discussion of digital transformation, and as we know, mobile technology has been, is one of the most uptaken technologies in the continent. We see the levels of adoption of mobile technologies exponentially growing in recent years. So how does that affect informal innovation in informal enterprises, and how can that be brought into the analysis is something that we're really looking at. Social media, digital technologies, and readiness for the 4IR, perhaps.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, that's really interesting. So the last question is from George Bauer. So he asks, several studies have provided evidence against the effectiveness of microcredit as an engine of small business growth. What are the tools beyond credit microfinance that innovation policymakers can use to actually support informal sector entrepreneurs? And I think the digitalization you already have talked about quite a lot. But yeah, what are the other tools?
Yes, in terms of again, I encourage you to have a look at our chapter in that book. We have a chapter that looks at policy approaches to support innovative entrepreneurs in the informal economy. So there are many different ways, and one can capitalize on the collective action of informal enterprise. It depends again on the particular configuration of informal activity that takes place in an area. So there are areas, for instance, clusters where they have associations, representative associations that really are very effective in negotiating the need for finance and different types of support for those enterprises forming part of the cluster. And in many cases, that has proven to be a very effective way of engaging with policymakers, of conveying the needs of informal entrepreneurs in a particular area. But that would work in an area where a cluster has a very strong sort of association representing firms, and it wouldn't work in another area where firms are more dispersed and operating in isolation. So again, this comes back to the need for acknowledging the diversity and heterogeneity of the informal enterprises and seeing what tools make more sense in different geographical territories.
Yeah, exactly. As always, context matters. So thank you so much, Erika, for this wonderful presentation and discussion. Thank you so much, Kate, for this discussion. Excellent. And yeah, as I said, we're really looking forward to your next adventures, Erika. And yeah, we'll be in touch very soon. And everybody else, have a great evening or wherever you are. And yeah, enjoy. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thanks, everybody. Have a nice rest of the day.